Night holds the coast like a breath held too long. In the command post, light leaks from blackout curtains, blue on maps pocked with pins. A runner's boots tap once. Twice, then silence. Cigarette ember. Wet wool. The brine of the channel coming through the cracks. Someone lifts binoculars and breathes out. The lenses fog, then clear. Beyond the dunes, the water has a sound it didn't have yesterday. A layered hum that becomes a tremor in the floorboards. Silhouettes creep out of the mist and multiply. Low hulls. Fat silhouettes. A standing forest of masts and cranes, signal lamps blinking like distant insects. The sea is no longer empty water, but a surface of intentions. Lanes, lines, wakes braided toward one shore. On the table, neat arrows still point where theory expects them to go. Outside, steel writes its own grammar. A telephone rings, muffled. A hand steadies a ruler. Bearings are read, corrected. Read again. Guns are quiet, the horizon louder than any command. German war diaries will later call it simply what it was. A sea full of ships. Stillness gives way to thunder. The question narrows not whether they are coming, but whether anything can stop them. That gray wall had a name. Neptune, the seaborne heart of Overlord, rode the June tide toward 5 codenamed strands, Utah and Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. It was 6 June 1944, first light along the Normandy coast where theory met surf. Above and behind it sat Schaeff, Eisenhower's coalition staff fusing fleets, armies, and air power into one timetable. Admiralty sailing lists, American embarkation tables, and RAF weather reports converged into lanes. NH hours. Admiral Bertram Ramsay commanded the naval arm. General Bernard Montgomery directed the land battle for the opening phase. 1st U.S. Army under Omar Bradley and British 2nd Army under Miles Dempsey would push from Sand to Bocage. Facing them stood O.B. West under Gerd von Rundstedt. Army Group B under Erwin Rommel held the Channel front. 7th Army guarded Normandy, while 15th Army watched Pas-de-Calais. Deception had worked. German staff still waited the threat to the straits, expecting the main blow where the coast narrows. Worse for them, reserve control was fragmented. Panzer divisions required release from higher authority, and the debate over forward defense versus a mobile counterstrike left armor in the wrong place. At the wrong time. Map room abstractions promised clarity, arrows, grids, neat pins. But reality arrived in spray and diesel. Allied joint orchestration thrived on distributed competence. Naval gunfire officers, beachmasters, fighter controllers, engineers, and coxswains each owned a piece of the clock. German centralized doctrine, layered with air paralysis and broken rail links, struggled to convert orders into motion. The Channel itself declared a verdict. The sea belonged to the coalition, and the sky leaned their way. This is the frame. Who stood where and why it mattered. Now we can ask the deeper question, not of courage alone, but of design. What system truly turned a morning sighting into pressure no garrison could unwind? Names and arrows told us who stood where. What filled the horizon was not a plan, but a machine. The Armada's 7,000 ships were more than spectacle. They were a living supply system that turned factories into firepower. At a coastline with no port, unstoppable wasn't a thunderclap. It was engineered into the whole. Redundancy. Throughput tempo. Redundancy meant parallel lanes, duplicate units, spare craft, and backup methods to move the same load if one failed. Throughput meant the beach became a conveyor, not a finish line. Waves timed to tides, loads pre-sorted, tasks standardized. So the next wave spent less time deciding. And more time doing. Tempo meant the cycle never relaxed. Minesweepers clearing ahead, escort screening, gunfire ships covering, landing craft unloading, salvage and medical teams staging the return trip. This was tactics made durable by logistics. While squads fought for a dune, planners fought for minutes. When to lift smoke, when to open a lane, when to flip a ship from troops to vehicles, when to roll engineers forward with tools instead of rifles. A heroic assault could seize a patch of sand. Only a system could keep it supplied, under fire and weather. Unstoppable lives in the arithmetic of lift per hour and replacement on demand. It lives in procedures that survive loss, in parts that interchange, in people trained to improvise within a plan. To feel that design at human scale, we'll drop from map room to eye level and watch the system move through a pair of hands. The machine breathes through people. 2 vantage points, 1 pair of eyes on the bluff, 1 pair of hands on a tiller, each feeling the system pass through them. In a concrete slit above the shore, a young artillery observer presses bone to binoculars. Damp air, oil on steel, wet wool. The plotting board glows under a shaded lamp. A grease pencil squeaks bearings. He reads, corrects, reads again. The sea deepens from gray to layered silhouettes, hulls stacked until the horizon is a ledger. He calls for lines, adjusts azimuth drums, pins a strip of tape across the map where the lanes converge. The floor hums with engines he cannot see, a vibration more certain than any rumor. Training says measure, the body says hide. He measures. The first brackets walk up the beach and off the bluff. White splashes below, dark fountains above. Down in the spray, a Higgins boat coxswain stands at the wheel, boots braced, diesel shaking his knees. He rehearses motions he no longer has to think about. Hand up to slow, circle to hold, 2 fingers to drop. When the keel kisses sand, faces crowd the ramp, chin straps tight, salt and fuel and sickness in the air. He reads the set of the waves, counts the seconds to the surf line, steals bearings off a smudge of church spire, off a balloon cable. Off smoke. Naval gunfire reaches for the bluffs, then steps back. He rides the pause and noses in. Their worlds touch in that thin water where doctrine ends and muscle memory begins. Now multiply them by thousands here and watch the pattern take shape. We pull back to the armada's bones, multiply those 2 by thousands, and the outline of the machine appears. The armada was not gathered in a week, but accreted over years. Hulls laid, crews trained, procedures drilled, warships to kill, transports to carry, and a scaffold of small craft to make a beach behave like a pier. Capital ships and cruisers ranged offshore to smother batteries. Destroyers waited to knife inward if the surf demanded point-blank gunnery. Around them clustered the working fleet, LSTs swallowing tanks and trucks, LCTs squatting low for the short shuttle, LCILs stacked with infantry, Liberty and Victory ships bringing bulk cargo and following echelons, tugs and salvage vessels to pull the unlucky back into the cycle. The geography of Britain became a launch pad. Multiple ports and anchorages, from sheltered roadsteads to tidal basins, were turned into conveyor belts, each with a marshalling area, a traffic plan, and a clock. Vehicles were waterproofed, chalked with serials, staged in pens, and loaded to landing tables that assigned every craft a time, a lane, and a payload. Minesweepers moved first, cutting corridors through the approaches so everything behind them could exist. Navigation vessels dropped buoys. Control craft herded columns into swept water. Escorts layered outward to keep submarines and E-boats hunting phantoms instead of convoys. Preloading made a one-day assault a campaign of scheduled arrivals. Assault waves carried engineers, tanks, and infantry. Follow-up convoys sailed on their wakes with fuel, ammunition, and more vehicles. Behind them, rolling resupply cycles waited for the next tide. The moon gave night light. The tide exposed obstacles at H hour, and returned later with depth for heavier ships. Weather ruled, but procedure bent with it, shifting H hours and routes without unthreading the whole. Years of industrial learning hid inside those neat minutes. Standardized hulls meant repairs and parts moved fast. Interchangeable fittings let crews solve new problems with familiar tools. Training turned chaos into choreography. Beachmasters with flags and megaphones, signalmen flashing orders down a file of silhouettes, coxswains reading the same checklists on different seas. Strip away the bravado, and you see procedure, multiplied. On the far shore lay concrete, wire, mines, and scattered reserves. On this shore lay assembly lines, shipyards, and a culture of planning. The collision between those 2 systems is where we go next. Up close. That collision had names: the Atlantic Wall and the assembly line. Concrete and wire promised certainty. Conveyor belts and checklists promised momentum. Up close it broke into islands of strength. Casemates. Wider stands Nestor, mine belts, separated by farm fields and tidal flats, all dependent on watchers, radios, and ammunition arriving on time. Scarcity shaped the German side before the first shot. Fuel was husbanded, so training miles and field exercises were thin. Radar coverage had gaps, and jamming made even good sets doubtful. The Luftwaffe was present in theory, and sporadic in practice, its airfields and fuel lines under pressure. Coastal shipping crept by night because daylight belonged to the enemy. Railways in France had been pounded for months. Bridges dropped, yards cratered, locomotives sidelined. Reserves existed, but permissions and competing doctrines pulled them in opposite directions. Hold the line at the surf, or save armor for a mobile counterblow inland. Either way, moving battalions through bombed rails and strafed roads was a race against a clock. The defender did not set abundance to find the Allied approach. Assembly lines in America and Britain had turned steel and plywood into a family of craft, whose parts and training overlapped. For every beach obstacle there was a tool. Bulldozers, Bangalore torpedoes, flails, demolition teams. For every wrecked craft, a tug or salvage ship to keep the lane open. Minesweepers persisted forward. Barrage balloons discouraged low strafers. Fighter control ships linked sea to sky. The Navy and Air Forces did not merely escort. They shaped the battlefield by isolating it. Static fortifications wagered on a perfect first hour. Mobile, resupplied assault systems wagered on endurance, on the next wave being stronger than the last. A casemate could kill. It could not move. An LST could return, reload, and come again. This is how scarcity meets abundance in the surf. Now we zoom from principle to consequence, to what that imbalance felt like under the guns and spray. The imbalance had a human temperature: salt, cold on lips, cordite in the throat. Destroyers eased in until the coast filled their bridges, guns thudding in a rhythm you felt in your ribs. When the fire lifted, another wave hit the sand. Men, then machines, then more men. Each set carrying tools the last wave lacked. Beach clearance teams made the unnatural natural. Bangalore charges punched seams through wire. Sappers flagged lanes. Flails and dozers chewed at obstacles, while craft ferried more explosives forward. When a lane closed under fire or wreckage, a salvage tug nosed in, lines out, dragging metal aside so the timetable could breathe. Mass meant repetition. A platoon that crawled past a seawall handed the breach to tanks with deep weighting stacks. Engineers followed with saws, poles, and tape. Traffic control waved the next company through. Medics worked at the waterline, pulling the living toward aid posts and back to rescue boats. Those boats turned and ran for LST sickbays and hospital ships, then returned empty, ready to be filled again. On the bluff, German companies that fought well still found the ground tilting. Hold a pocket and a fresh assault lands downshore. Knock out a tank and two more grind in behind the smoke. Machine gun teams that owned a patch of shingle at 0700 faced naval gunfire at 0710 and a flanking party at 720. Valor bought minutes. The system spent them. When guns found the beach, counter battery and smoke smothered them. When mines took a toll, gap teams rebuilt lanes. When communications frayed, standing procedures carried the day. Cumulative pressure turned patches of sand into corridors. By afternoon, stacks formed, flags marked exits, and the surf started to behave like infrastructure. The next step is to see how that rhythm sustained itself. Where no port existed, corridors on sand are not ports. They are promises that must be kept. The Allies kept them by building a harbor out of pieces they brought with them, turning fragile beach into an engineered interface. First came the breakwaters. Gooseberry lines of old merchantmen were run aground and scuttled, hulls settling into a ragged crescent that took the sting from the swell and gave small craft a lee. Inside that man-made calm, the mulberries grew. Concrete phoenix caissons floated across the channel, then sunk to form a perimeter. From them, modular whale roadways reached inland, held up by beetle floats that rode the tide. Ships no longer had to gamble the surf. They could nose to a floating pier, drop a ramp, and feed the beach without touching sand. Where depth or weather still argued, improvisation bridged the gap. DWWIs waddled from ship to shore with ammunition and fuel. Rhino ferries, pontoon rafts with outboards, shuttled vehicles off LSTs when the tide refused. Beach groups made the shoreline a throughput machine, traffic circuits, numbered exits, signposts on stakes, bulldozers pushing berms, recovery teams dragging wrecks aside before they became dams. Salvage craft threaded the lanes, determined that a single sunk hull would not become policy. Fire support merged with logistics. Naval gunfire spotters tied ships' batteries to Army guns and fighter bombers, blinding an enemy piece the moment it barked at a pierhead. The radios that sequenced landing tables called smoke and counter battery, because a port in a box survives. Only if the box keeps breathing. Isolation finished the equation. Air interdiction made the battlefield an island, strangling rail movement and punishing daylight roads. With approaches suppressed and lanes organized, the second week became different from the first. Not assault, but sustained delivery, rotation, repair, routine. Fuel would follow the same logic. As the lodgment deepened, PLUTO crept in, a pipeline under the sea that turned tanker convoys into pressure at the nozzle. But systems have edges. Weather, command delays, and luck will press on every joint, questions we have to face before calling any of it truly inevitable. Those edges mattered. Before we call it unstoppable, we have to test the joints. The window was razor thin. Weather almost scrubbed the launch. A transient break made it possible to sail. Had winds held or cloud ceilings sunk, airborne drops would have scattered farther. Spotters would have seen less, and small craft would have fought the surf instead of the clock. Contingency, not inevitability, governed the opening moves. Omaha especially teetered. Beach obstacles, accurate fire, and mislanded waves compounded into paralysis, until destroyers closed to knife range and small groups clawed exits through the bluffs. A different sequence, more smoke staying low, a few key radios failing, a reserve company arriving sooner, could have driven losses higher and delayed the breakout from the shingle. Delay is not defeat, but on a shoreline, time is blood. A June gale later tore one Mulberry to pieces, scattering caissons and peeling roadways from their mounts. The surviving harbor and the beaches carried the burden, and Cherbourg's rehabilitation came at a cost. The point is clear. Engineered resilience does not erase vulnerability. It manages it. German options were real, even if poorly executed. Earlier, coherent movement of armored reserves, concentrated rather than piecemeal, might have worsened Allied losses and pushed some beaches back toward the water. Yet air interdiction, naval gunfire, and broken communications pressed against any such counterattack. Historians divide on how much difference timing could have made. The record shows doors that were open, and doors that were closing fast. The transportation plan that isolated Normandy also destroyed stations and neighborhoods, and naval bombardment pounded towns that lay too close to the coast. Estimates vary. The civilian cost was heavy. Acknowledging contingency and cost sharpens, not weakens, the picture. With that in view, we can see why the second tide became decisive for the Allies. Contingency and cost framed the morning. Then the sea kept its appointment, and with the second tide, the calculus changed. LSTs shouldered in behind the earlier waves, decks stacked with tanks, guns and engineers who spoke the language of lanes and tonnage. LCTs shuttled like ferries. WWIs waddled through chop with fuel and ammunition. Bulldozers pushed berms into roads. Beach groups had names for every patch of sand, exits, dumps, transit areas, and a rhythm for every hour. Salvage crews dragged wrecks clear. Medics turned casualties into manifest numbers, outbound to ships and inbound to replacements. What had been an assault front thickened into a service network. Comms tents humming, traffic control flags snapping, artillery tractors grinding up the first rises to emplace tubes and register fire. Across the line, German intent still burned. But movement faltered. Telephone lines were down. Runners took longer. Liaison cars hit craters or roadblocks made of fear and rubble. Authority to move armored reserves sat too high, too far. By the time orders found the right battalions, daylight and air interdiction had found them first. Counterattacks arrived in fragments, brave, sharp, and local, only to meet fresh units, naval gunfire on call, and fighter bombers watching the roads like tollkeepers. Depth is what changed the fight. A beach is vulnerable. A beachhead, with anti-tank guns posted, mortars dug in, engineers working under a flag system, and field artillery registered, is momentum embodied. Morning doubt gave way to afternoon wait, and wait translated into choice. Hold the ground, extend the exits, link the pockets. From this hour on, courage still mattered, but arithmetic began to rule. Next, we balanced scales. Afternoon wait had tipped the fight, but wait alone never crossed a yard of shingle. At Omaha, a sapper hugged the seawall long enough to set a charge that gave strangers a gap. At Juneau, a section leader bullied his fear into motion and led through surf that tugged at ankles and rifles. At Sword, a troop commander found a DD tank, coaxed its gun onto a casemate. and announced the breach with dust and silence. Yet the odds that made those moments possible were written elsewhere. Naval gunfire tables told destroyers when to creep shoreward. Spotting nets linked beach, ship, and air. Radar-controlled fire turned glimpses into patterns. Minesweeping lanes, buoyed and numbered, took luck out of navigation and handed it to procedure. Escort screens layered outward so that E-boats prowled edges and met starshell halos, DF bearings, and fast, angry gunfire. U-boats stalked, but jeep carriers flew patrols. Destroyer escorts rolled depth-charge ladders, and watchstanders treated each radar blip as a math problem with a time limit. Edge-case disasters still happened. A mine lifting a ramp, a coastal gun finding a range, a torpedo in the dark. The system absorbed them by substitution. Another craft, another lane, another wave, and kept the mean trending safer across the hour. Tactical episodes felt like coin flips. The aggregate forced the coin to land on its edge. This is the contrast. Singular courage versus orchestrated suppression. A handful of names versus the quiet dominance of checklists. With lanes firm and the sky leaning allied, arithmetic began creating choices inland. Next, we watch what choices were made when the beachhead turned into a springboard. Those choices began with roads, dumps, and a clock. With lanes firm, the beachhead turned from a knife edge into a springboard, and the work shifted from taking sand to feeding an army. Engineers repaired roads and rails outward from the shore, laid Bailey bridges where spans were gone, and graded exits until trucks could grind up and over the bluffs. Cross-channel lift did not taper. It multiplied. Ships landing vehicles, depots stacking crates, beachmasters turning beaches into schedules. The surviving Mulberry at Arromanches became a lung, inhaling cargo through floating roadways, while Cherbourg, once secured, was cleared and dredged to take the weight that sand could not. PLUTO entered service, modest at first, turning sea lanes into a pipeline. Mobility followed. A dedicated truck fleet hauled fuel and ammunition day and night. A rolling river tying ships to forward dumps and then to gun lines. As rails returned, trains shouldered bulk loads and freed trucks for the last miles. With supply in depth, the lodgment sponsored maneuvers instead of merely absorbing blows. Perch and Epsom probed around Caen. Cobra broke the bocage open in late July, trading hedgerow attrition for open road acceleration. The Falaise encirclement took shape as converging columns squeezed the retreat. Paris fell to liberation. In August, a political and logistical victory made possible by the ability to sustain momentum, far from the surf. Post-war German assessments often credited Allied logistics and air interdiction for this shift. Others argued that reserve control, fuel shortages, and command interference mattered more than Allied genius. Both can be true. A defender hampered by scarcity met an attacker organized for abundance. From beach scarcity to continental abundance, the hinge was systems thinking, redundancy, throughput, tempo. In the next beat, we gather those threads and name the hidden gears that made unstoppable a property of design. We've followed momentum from surf to Paris. Now we compress it into principle. The pattern is clearer when the noise is filtered out. Modern amphibious success is less a charge than a manufactured ecosystem, redundant, resilient, and faster to repair than the defender can break. Unstoppable wasn't a spell. It was mechanics executed under air and sea control. Start with standardization, hull types, fittings, procedures that let strangers swap parts, roles, and checklists. Add sequencing with minesweep, mark, escort, suppress, land, clear, reload, a cadence that kept friction from accumulating. Then substitution. When a lane closed or a ship died, another took its place because planning assumed loss. Overlay suppression. Fighter bombers and naval guns that didn't end resistance but reduced its effects to tolerable levels. Finally, synchronization. Radios and prearranged signals that made crafts and units act like one organism. This is myth versus mechanism. Tactics mattered, but logistics made tactics reliable. Courage mattered, but capacity determined whether courage could be spent and then replenished. The German system prized concrete and a decisive counterstroke. The Allied system prized flow of fuel, information, and replacements, creating choices faster than the defender could respond. Systems do not erase sacrifice or civilian cost. They explain why an army that bleeds still advances. They also warn that without control of sea and sky, the machine starves. To end, we leave the blueprint for a gear. A concrete phoenix, tide-scarred at Aromanches, the geometry of a harbor in a box. Here it is. The gear, tide-lapped at Aromanches. A phoenix caisson sits like a grounded whale beneath the chalk cliffs. Concrete pitted, rust-veining old bolt holes. Barnacles rim its ankles. Weed combs the seams. At low tide, you can walk to the shadow of its wall and lay a palm on stone that once floated, then sank on command, becoming shelter for ships that fed an army. The surf speaks in the old meter, push, pause, withdraw, where once a harbor answered back. In that ring of caissons, whale roadways reached inland, beetle floats bobbing under truck tires. Now gulls land where cranes once swung. One object remains. A fleet echoes through it. Ruin versus memory, silence versus the logistics it housed. Stand here and the image folds back to that gray horizon. The moment plan met steel. The lesson, victory and pieces bolted together. Count the waves. Consider the hands that set this in place. Their work makes the present possible. If you've stood at Aromanches, or if your family carried some piece of that harbor ashore, add your voice below. Share unit histories, declog memories, or letters tied to D-Day. We'll pin helpful sources so others can learn. What hidden gear should we unpack next? Minesweeping, beach groups, or the deception that held Pas-de-Calais? Tell us where to dig. Was this invasion unstoppable or inevitable in hindsight? Keep debate respectful. Facts first, honor always. Subscribe if you value logistics-driven history that blends human stories with the machinery that carried them.